Hello and welcome to the webinar. Now today we're going to talk about confidence and the 10 steps to gaining confidence. Now with this I want to talk about both riding confidence and horse confidence. And I think horse confidence is something that we don't think enough about. You know, we're always so sort of concerned about our own riding confidence that we forget that we need to be riding a confident horse. I think that's very important. So today we're going to talk about both of those things. So when we're talking about confidence, what exactly do we mean? And to me, confidence means knowing what might happen next. Now, we're never going to know exactly what's going to happen next, but we can have a fairly good idea if we have some knowledge about our horse, some knowledge about horse training, and if we have some skill. So some skill in training horses and some skill in recognizing where the horse is at and some riding skill or handling skill, whatever we're doing. So that's what we need to be confident. So the first thing I want to look at is really the psychology of confidence itself. What we need to do when we decide that we're lacking confidence, and it's something that I hear a lot, you know, everything's fine, I just need a bit more confidence. Well, what we need to do is make a decision today to only deal with the future. Let's not dwell on what's happened in the past. If you talk to any horse rider, anyone who's been around horses, everybody's got a dreadful story. Everybody's had a scary experience. Everybody's had an accident. There's just no way that you can get around that. If we dwell on that, we're not going to be able to move forward because that's going to paralyze us. If you look at a lot of these times when you've had a nasty accident or something, you are actually suffering post-traumatic stress disorder to some extent. And if you look at the modern ways of dealing with that, none of them involve reliving that stress. None of them do. Some of them might involve a little bit of it, but you always visualize it and put a better ending on it, or you rewrite the whole story in your head, and those are fabulous things to do. So the last thing you want to do is think too much about what's happened in the past and think too much about why it is you lost your confidence in the first place. We can't change the past, and no matter how much we think about it, it's never going to get any better. It's probably only going to get worse in our mind than it was actually in reality. So let's start with that. The first thing is only to deal with the future. I went to a clinic once. I took a couple of my clients along with me, and it was a clinic about confidence. And I thought, oh, this would be quite good for these people because they are, you know, lacking a little bit of confidence, and, you know, this will be just the thing for them. So I took them along, and I went and I sat in for the morning only because I had to leave at lunchtime. There was 2 hours. There must have been about a dozen people in this clinic. And the first 2 hours were spent without horses, sitting around, and each person went through their story of why they were lacking confidence. So we had a dozen stories about accidents, about breaking your back, about how terrifying things were. Most of the participants were crying. And I will tell you something, there is no way in the world I would have got on a horse at lunchtime. There's no way in the world. It had put me in such a state where I was so nervous that, and that's, you know, ridiculous coming from me. I'm very confident because I understand where my horses are in their training and that sort of thing. But I was at the stage there after 2 hours of listening to these stories and watching these people relive these horrendous experiences where I'd completely lost my confidence. And that sort of thing is terrific if you want to keep people trapped in that place. I don't want to keep you trapped in that place. I want you to get out of there, and I want to give you really good reasons to be confident. This is not about tricks or gimmicks. I'm not going to teach you to put your horse's head down and tell you that's going to make a difference. It's not. It's really not. What you need is you need to have a positive plan. You need a plan. Any plan at all will do, but you need a positive plan. So each time you go out to deal with your horse, whether it's just catching him in the paddock or whether it's teaching him flying changes, you need a plan. And the thing to do is to start with that plan. You can vary. You can get out there and say, okay, well, he wasn't ready for flying changes today, or, I couldn't catch him today. That's all right. We can slightly alter that plan, but we need to start with a plan. So that's the first thing. Now, when you're setting up your plan, you want to run through that in your mind in the progressive steps. So let's say you were going to teach flying changes to your horse. You'd need to say, right, okay, well, I've got independent shoulder control. I've got independent hindquarter control. I can move the hindquarters from left to right while keeping the shoulders still. All these things working progressively towards your goal, which is flying changes. What you don't want to do is run through the worst case scenario for each of these things. So let's say you can't catch your horse, you go out to the paddock. The plan is to walk straight up to the horse and to catch him. If that doesn't work, then you might have some alternative plans, such as you might back away from the horse, asking him to come to you, and you might reward him by releasing that mental pressure on him when he turns his head to face you. And that might be a good first starting place. What you don't want to do is run through all the worst case scenarios that might happen, because that's going to take you right back to your lacking confidence. The reason you're lacking confidence is because you've been living in the past. So we need to go forward and think about the future. So the second point then is to understand it yourself. So you've got a plan, you've got a lesson that you're going to teach. It's really important that you understand that. You're the teacher, so you have to make this make sense to the horse. Now, it's not going to make sense to the horse unless it makes sense to you first. So it's very important. And let's say you're teaching the horse to turn and face you. It's very important that you understand exactly what you want that horse to do. So let's go through the 4 principles of training. First of all, you've got a spot on the horse you want to move. You've got a direction that you want that to go. You've got a motivator, something that is going to get the horse to change. And you've got a reward for doing the right thing, so the horse knows when he moves that spot in the direction you want it to go, that he's going to be rewarded for doing that. So let's go back to our example of getting the horse to turn and face you. The spot on the horse might be the horse's nose. The direction we want it to go might be left or right, depending on where we are. So we want it to move towards us. The motivator, now in this case, you probably just have the horse free in the paddock. So your motivator is probably going to be some sort of verbal cue, so a cluck or something. That is a pressure of some kind. You're putting the horse under some sort of psychological pressure by clucking at him. So I'd make this sort of noise like that, and that will get his attention. And the reward for that, when he moves his head towards you, is going to be to stop clucking, which releases the pressure, and probably to praise him. So you'd stop clucking and you'd say, good boy. Perhaps you've got a horse that is very difficult to catch, so you're a long way away from the horse, and you can do that from a distance. If you were close to the horse, and let's say you were much further on with this lesson, when the horse turned and faced you, you would stop clucking and you would pat the horse on the head or on the neck, depending on how far it moved towards you. So the idea is to break the lesson down. So if the horse is hard to catch, it might just be looking at you in the paddock. You'll release on looking at you. As you progress, you'll start to release on the horse actually moving its feet towards you. And that's a really clear breakdown of the lesson. Before you begin your lesson, whether it's that or teaching half pass, whatever it is, you need to visualize that before you start. And we go back again to the plan that you made, a nice positive plan. Don't visualize it all going horribly wrong. You want to build confidence. You need to visualize success. And they have shown that your brain doesn't really know the difference between things you visualize and things you actually do. And athletes use this a lot. They visualize themselves standing up on the podium at the Olympics, winning the gold medal. And we can do that too in our own little way with our horse training. I always visualize a successful lesson. So I walk myself through the lesson and I visualize the whole thing in my head from start to finish with it going right. Empathize with your horse. I think this is really important. I think it's really important that you are able to put yourself in your horse's position. So think about the lesson from your horse's perspective. It's going to make it much easier for you to teach the lesson if you can do this. So let's go back to our little example of where you want the horse to turn and face you in the paddock. So really all you're doing at first to break this lesson down is to get him to move his eyes towards you. So you're clucking at him and he moves his eyes and you stop clucking and he works out that's a release. So with that lesson, if you can get your horse to move his head, eventually his feet will follow his nose. So the idea is just to get him to turn his neck further and further until his feet move. And once he's unlocked his feet a little bit, he's likely to come quite quickly. And that's empathizing with your horse. That's understanding the lesson from the horse's point of view. Of course, the horse doesn't understand what you want him to do. It's a bit like riding a straight line down the center of the arena in a dressage test. The horse doesn't understand you want to ride a straight line. So what you have to do is mentally put yourself in his position. And how is he best going to understand this? How can I best explain this to the horse? So with your lesson, you want to start from strong foundations. Now, do you have, or does your horse have, good foundation training? What is good foundation training? And it varies from person to person, really, who you talk to. I would consider foundation training anything up to basic lateral work. So good foundation trained horse to me is soft in the bridle, travels in frame, uses his top line, is elevated in the shoulders, can get his hindquarter underneath him. So you've got independent shoulder control, so you could do shoulder in, for example. You've got independent hindquarter control, you could do travers. What you probably haven't done yet is put those two things together, so you probably haven't gone to half pass or side pass yet, and you probably haven't done any of that work in the canter, so you haven't done sort of flying changes or anything like that. But before that, lateral work and the flying changes, I would consider all of that foundation training. And it doesn't need to take you a long time. If you start that properly from the beginning, it should be just as easy to have all of that in the first 3 months of training as any other horse. So you've got that if your horse does all those things. If your horse hasn't got that, then that's the great place to start. Any horse can have good foundation training. It doesn't need to have had it as a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old. You can take a 10-year-old horse that's done any sort of riding or no riding at all and still put this foundation training on that horse. But this is the place you want to build from. If you start to build from a very poor foundation, you're going to find you spend your whole time filling holes. So you're going to get, let's say, your horse has got beautiful canter strike offs that say is really elevated in the shoulder, and all of these things are great, but you haven't really got independent hindquarter control, so you can't really move the hindquarters without moving the shoulders. And you come to teach flying changes, for example, you might well find that your horse disunites in the change. So he only changes in front, he doesn't change behind. It's not unusual. What it means is there's a hole in your foundation training. So you haven't got the foundation to teach that. And so when you get there and try and teach it, you're going to have to go way back to the foundation work to get that independent hindquarter control. Now, it's actually much quicker just to start from the beginning. If you've got a new horse and you're not sure, I'd be starting from the beginning and say, right, we'll just work our way through this foundation training. and make sure everything's in place before we progress. So getting the right trainers is really important. If you're working on your confidence, what you need is trainers that are appropriate to your level and people that you like and get on with and that sort of thing. So foundation training is a bit like kindergarten. I would be sticking to one trainer or one method for your foundation training. After that, I think it's like high school, you know, and so you want a different teacher for maths and English and, you know, all of these sorts of things, and you start to diversify. But foundation training, I think you need to try and stick with one method for your horse and yourself. I also think it's really important that you foundation train your horse. I can't stress that enough. I think it's the most important time of the horse's life, the horse's training, and I think it's really important that you do it yourself. If you do it yourself and it goes wrong, you know how to correct it. If you do it yourself, you know it's ethical. If you do it yourself, you know when the horse understands and when he doesn't. You know if there's a hole in your training or not. I think it's very important that you do your own foundation training. I'm often, you know, get people saying to me, oh, you know, I want to buy a horse and I'm going to send it to you to be broken in and then, you know, I'll get it back and it'll all be marvelous. And I'm very reluctant to take horses on for that purpose, because I think even for novice riders, I think they're better off getting the horse and learning with the horse. I've seen some, you know, very novice riders come along with completely untouched horses whose riding has come along with the horse, and they've both progressed together and they've both done very well. And what's happened is the person teaches the horse, so they're learning together and one is not teaching the other. What happens when you get the horse much more experienced than the rider is that the horse will come down to the rider's level. Horses don't teach riders, riders teach horses. So the novice rider will teach the horse novice stuff. The experienced horse won't teach the novice rider experienced stuff. So, you know, it's all very well to ride a schoolmaster once in a while, and that's a great way to get some practice and to practice your riding and get your seat and your position, all that sort of thing. But don't expect the horse to teach you how to teach that. This doesn't work like that. You're teaching the horse all the time. You're teaching the horse. So when you're looking for a trainer, I'd look at that trainer's finished horses. So look at the sorts of horses that that trainer is producing. Look at their horses or the horses that they show or the horses they've trained with other people, and see if you like the way those horses go. If you don't like the way the horses go, find somebody else. Most trainers these days have websites that you can go and look at. Hopefully, they've got websites with tons of video and things with the trainer doing stuff on there. If they haven't, I'd avoid them, because I think they're probably hiding something. You know, I think you need a website. I've got a website with tons of stuff on it so that people can go there. They can spend an hour there looking at it. If they don't like it, then they don't like me, and I'm not interested in having them as a client. And I think that, you know, that should be the case. You don't want to find out later. You don't want to get into a relationship with a trainer and your horse and find, oh gosh, you know, I actually don't like the way this person rides or handles the horses or their methodology, whatever. You want to know this up front. So investigate people, talk to people, and question the methods they use. You know, whose methods are they? Where did the methods originate? Who did they study with? What are their qualifications? It's really important that you find out, you know, actually what people's qualifications are. There's a lot of trainers out there that don't have any, which is fine if they're really good and they're showing you great finished horses and their methodology is very good and they can explain it well, that's fine. And, you know, have a look at the ethics. There's a real white coat phenomena goes on with horse training, that people tend to give their horse to a trainer. In a clinic situation, it happens a lot. I hear about it a lot. You know, I handed my horse over to the trainer and he started beating it. You know, I'm like, well, don't do that. you've got to question this. And sometimes, we look at these trainers and we think, oh, yes, but they know better than I do because I have no experience. So how do we know whether a method is ethical or not? And I use a really simple little test, and I tell people to do this all the time. I say, right, look at what they're doing and tell me, would you do that to a child? They take a 3-year-old child. Would you do that to a child? So let's say they're chasing the horse around the round pen for half an hour until it's dripping with sweat. Would you do that to a child? No, I think your answer's going to be no. Well, don't use it. Don't use the method. I saw something on Facebook the other day, which was this horse had been in a show jumping competition and he had some broken skin from the spur on his side. So obviously the rider had spurred him. I actually watched the rider's jumping round, and he didn't intentionally kick the horse at all. So these spur marks had come where they'd broken the skin, had come unintentionally from that rider, which certainly doesn't make it any better. Perhaps if he can't control where his heels are, he shouldn't be wearing spurs, would be my feeling. But a lot of people on there were saying, oh, yes, but it's not as bad as so-and-so. Well, being not as bad as so-and-so doesn't make it good. And I think we need to remember that. Would you do that to your 3-year-old? No, you wouldn't. So you shouldn't do it to your horse. It's quite a simple, quite an easy way to put an ethical test on things, I think. So still on the ethics, we're 5 freedoms. The RSPCA is 5 freedoms. These are things that you need to think about all the time, before, during, and after training. Your horse must be free from hunger and thirst. Now, if there are people around apparently that use water deprivation to train horses, and they deny them food as well. Number 2, they should be free from discomfort. And it's very hard to say that your horse would be free from discomfort if you're jabbing it with the spurs. So there's another one. Pain, injury, disease. Again, these things we need to look, and we will in future points, about saddle fitting. A lot of people do train with pain, whether they realize it or not. So that's something to be really careful of. Your horse should be free to express normal behavior. And so that's things like where the horse is housed. Can it lie down? Can it run around? Can it talk to other horses? Does it have mates? And the last one, free from fear and distress. And that's a big one to consider in training, because it's very important that you can recognize these things. It's very important that you can recognize if your horse is fearful or is distressed. And we'll talk about that a bit later as well. So physical health, you go back to the 5 freedoms. It's important to do your body condition score. So make sure that your horse isn't under or overweight when you start a training program with your horse. If you're going to put a bit in its mouth, I would have it see the dentist. You want to be wearing appropriate tack, and the tack should fit. I think one of the biggest problems I see, and a lot of the reason people lose confidence, is because they've worn ill-fitting saddles. Horses have started bucking because their back is sore. So again, you go back to one of those freedoms, freedom from discomfort. So 2 and 3, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain. And you get an ill-fitting saddle, the horse has been hurt, the horse starts to bark, and suddenly, I was really confident before my horse started to bark. And so that's terribly important, that you get the saddle properly fitted, and also that your bridle fits. And lessons need to be an appropriate length. A lot of the time, you hear things about how young horses, especially we do this to young horses. So we're talking about foundation training. Confidence comes from foundation training. Young horses who are ridden for an hour a day, or young horses that need miles under their belt, or wet saddlecloth days, and all these things that you hear. And I'm like, wow, you you've taken a 3-year-old horse quite often out of the paddock and you've given it a week to get it under saddle or 2 weeks to get it under saddle, and then you're guaranteeing you're going to ride it for an hour a day, probably in a saddle that hasn't been fitted specifically to that horse. I could almost guarantee that. And then you expect the horse not to be injured. Well, it's most unlikely. So if you're doing lessons with young horses or educationally young horses where they're exhausted, be it chasing them around the round pen or riding them for miles and hours, the horse is most likely just to slip into learned helplessness. And it's very hard to say really whether it's learning anything or not. What it is learning is that there is no escape from the pressure, which is really not something you want your horse to learn. Horses that are described as dull are often in learned helplessness. So what they've discovered is that whatever they do, there is no escape from that. So when the rider gets on, they switch off and they just do as they're told for however long that takes, and then the rider gets off. And these horses become very depressed and really are no fun to ride, and it's very sad for them. So when is your horse learning? Your horse is learning when he's feeling good, when he's engaged, in the same way as a child would be. Now, we'd never run a child 17 times around the oval and then say, right, now sit down, we'll do algebra, which is often what we do with a horse. You go to a show and you see people out there lunging their horses for 45 minutes before they get on. And, you know, you see it at clinics as well. The problem is, if you lunge your horse for 45 minutes this week, you're going to need to lunge it for 50 minutes next week because it's going to be that much fitter. So, you know, I think there's only one thing more dangerous than an unfit, uneducated horse, and that's a fit, uneducated horse. So be very careful with that. I want the horse to be alert and engaged. And if he's tired, he's not learning. And if he's in pain, he's not learning. So mental health, back to the 5 freedoms. I think it's very important that you recognize fear and stress. There's a course on my website which is about emotional level, and it goes through all the various signs of horses that are fearful or horses that are stressed, and that's quite a useful little thing if you're not very familiar with that. Things like a high head, high legs, so when they're picking their feet up very high, when their tail is high, when their head is high, when their ears are forward, and their nostrils are flared and their muzzle is clenched. All of these things are indications of fear and stress. It's very important to plan a lesson at an appropriate level. So an appropriate level where you're teaching the horse things that it's going to be able to be successful at. So back to our example earlier, you know, if your horse hasn't got independent hindquarter control and you're going to teach it flying changes, it's unlikely to be successful at that. So take it step by step, sequentially. And so when is the horse not learning? Well, the horse is not learning when he's tired. The horse is not learning when he's shut down, when he's in learned helplessness, and he's not learning when he's scared. So the emotional level, now, I think about emotional level as all of those things that go in to make up, you know, how your horse is sort of presenting itself at the time. You know, is it flighty? Is it alert? Is it relaxed? Is it asleep? All these things that that make up your horse's sort of emotional level for that time. So a horse, usually horses have a natural emotional level, and if we're saying it's out of 100, so 50 would be your normal horse. Your average sort of horse standing around in the paddock is a 50 out of 100. You know, he's not excited, he's not asleep, he's just a normal horse, average, 50. You get some horses that are naturally more emotional than others. So you might get an Arab mare or something that's quite excitable, and she might be naturally a 65. So when you brought her out of the paddock, she's not a 50, she's a 65. And when you tried to load her on the trailer, she might go up to a 75. You'd be a bit more emotional. Training is all about manipulating that emotional level and learning to control it. It's very tempting, especially if you have that Arab mare that's a natural 65. It's very tempting to spend your whole time trying to lower the emotional level, trying to bring the emotional level down. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. You simply can't do it. The only way you can learn to manipulate the emotional level is by raising it and lowering it. And that really is what training is all about. I think, and I found when I did my engagement zone experiment, I found that horses showed fewer conflict behaviors when they were engaged to learn. So it wasn't raising it a huge amount. It was actually only raising the emotional level as looked at by sort of heart rate by about 16%. So if you've got a horse that's naturally a 50, if you raise it up to sort of a 65, you're likely to have the horse engaged. I think once you go over sort of 70 or 75, then your horse is probably getting scared. But I think if you're below that 65 sort of level at sort of 60 or 55, your horse is just not engaged enough to be learning. You think about it like a classroom situation. So in the classroom, you've got one of those teachers that tells great stories and the kids are engaged and they're having fun and they're listening and it's wonderful. You also get teachers that scream and yell and threaten detention. And the children aren't engaged. They're way too emotional. They're frightened. They're thinking about ways of getting out. And then you have a teacher that speaks in monotone, is really dull. And of course the kids, again, they're not learning. They're not engaged at all. They're falling asleep or they're daydreaming about something else. So there is that engagement zone area, and that's what we need to find when we're training. So it's slightly above their normal resting rate because you want them to be engaged and thinking about the lesson, but it's not very high. So it's not much higher. And I think it's sort of between 10 and 20% above what they normally would be if you looked at their heart rates. So we learn to lower the emotional level by practicing raising it. So when you take that Arab mare who comes out of the paddock as a 65, we still have to raise that. So if she's naturally a 65, you need to take her up to a 70 or a 75. And this is the thing that people find difficult. This is also the thing that is going to give you confidence, because once you learn to raise it, at the same time, what goes up must come down. At the same time, you learn to lower it. You cannot do one without the other. You cannot just lower it. You have to learn to raise it. So what we do in training is raise it in a controlled level. So raise it a little bit and bring it down, and raise it up and bring it down, and raise it up and bring it down. And that way we have the ability to manipulate it like that, to be able to control it a little bit, rather than just, going out with your fingers crossed and hoping on a wing and a prayer that everything's going to be all right, because quite often it's not. So the first place that I start with all training is with the bridle work, with Give to the Bit, which gives me somewhere to take the horse to say, hey, just give to this pressure, soften in the bridle and listen to me. And what that does is initially raises the emotional level, but after a while, if the horse raises his emotional level himself by seeing a tractor or getting frightened by something, we can say, oh, okay, just soften in the bridle and listen to me. And the horse immediately comes back and the level lowers again. So working with your horse, I think it's really important to remember that horses aren't rude, ignorant, arrogant, stupid, or anything else that we so often hear. Horses, they're they don't conceptualize like that. You know, your horse doesn't think, oh gosh, you know, today I'm going to be really naughty or something. They just don't. If a horse is behaving in a certain way, it's because it's been taught to behave in that way. So if a horse rears, for example, it's been taught to rear. It's been given a release of pressure at that time. So what you've got to do with a horse that rears or bolts or bucks or anything like that is teach it something else, not punish it for rearing, because then you're getting into a vicious cycle and your problem is going to get worse, because it's very hard not to release the horse at that time. If the horse rears and falls over backwards, then it's definitely going to get a release because you're going to come off. So don't think about it as the horse being naughty. Think about it as the horse having learned something that is not useful to you. Okay, so what we need to do is teach the horse something that is useful. So by calling your horse naughty or rude or ignorant or disrespectful is another one I hear all the time, you know, which respect is not a concept a horse can understand. Horses that step on you or walk all over you quite simply haven't been taught to lead properly. It's not that they're being rude. So if we do sort of say, oh, you know, that horse is rude or disrespectful, we tend to pigeonhole them. We tend to judge them and pigeonhole them, which I think is very dangerous. And I think it changes the way we behave towards the horse. So if you get a horse and somebody hands the horse to you, you know, you've got to say, lead it across the paddock or something. And they say, oh, watch out, he's really rude, he's really disrespectful, he'll walk all over you. You're probably quite likely to be quite rough on that horse if he does look like doing that. If they hand you the horse and say, oh, this poor horse has, you know, never been taught anything, and he's very nervous, and if he's nervous, he's likely to step on you. You know, so could you please teach him how to lead while you go across the paddock? Then I think you're going to approach that in a very different way. Horses go through learning curves. So if you come out with your horse, let's say you're teaching it to lead, and you have a 20-minute lesson, which is quite a good length of time for an educationally young horse. They can't concentrate for more than 20 minutes. Give it a 20-minute lesson. At the end of the lesson is really good. You come out again the next day and you think, oh my gosh, you know, he knows nothing. He's forgotten the whole lesson. He's probably just going through a bit of a learning curve. So horses don't sort of just get better and better and better. They tend to get better and then they get bad again. Then they get good, even better than before, and then they get really bad and then they get great. And so you've got to watch out for these curves, and you'll see it whenever you teach something. And as soon as you start teaching things, which is the way you gain confidence, you will see these horses go through these learning curves. You know, just when you think he's got it, he gets really bad at it. And say, oh, that's okay. You know, maybe he's tired, or maybe, you know, we haven't been going long enough. Maybe we've been going too long. Whatever it might be, expect curves. It doesn't just go on an upward trajectory. So everything that your horse learns is dependent on his foundation training. Okay, so we've been through this. You can't teach flying changes before you've got independent hindquarter and shoulder control. So everything depends on a good, strong foundation. So if that's where you need to start there, whatever age your horse is. Remember also, the horse has two sides. So you've got two horses. You might get some things transferred from one side to the other, but you're not going to get very much. So every time you go to the other side, it's a whole new lesson. So you've got to start right at the beginning again. The Polo Pony Piaffe, you know, you can teach any horse anything. Some horses are going to look better doing some things than other horses. So, for example, you know, I had a polo pony in America, and she had the most correct Piaffe. It was beautifully correct. It wasn't beautiful because she was a polo pony and she had polo pony movement. But you can teach a horse anything you want to teach it, as long as you have a really good lesson plan. Not all horses are going to look great doing all things, but you certainly won't stop you teaching them. A lot of people say to me, oh, you know, can you teach my horse to Piaffe? And I'll go, I don't know, can your horse trot? If the answer is yes, well then yes, we can teach it to Piaffe. The final and the most important thing is just to do something. A lot of people say to me, oh, I didn't want to ruin him, or I didn't want to muck it up, so I didn't do anything. Well, I really think as long as you're not going to go into the paddock and hit your horse over the head with a 2x4, you're probably not going to ruin him or do too much damage. If you've listened all the way through this, I'm going to assume you're the sort of person that if they do something, they'll do something good. So go out and do something. If you want some ideas of what to teach to gain confidence, and by teaching things, you will gain confidence, I promise you. It's really easy once you've broken the lesson down. That's what the Can Do Club online training does for you. It breaks lessons down into their simplest parts to make it easy for you to train. The lessons on there are short videos. So the videos go for 5 to 10 minutes maximum. So for a lesson, let's say we're teaching shoulder control, for example, there might be 8 videos in the lesson, each of them 5 to 10 minutes. There's also a 1 hour full-length sort of training video, which is different material, and you should watch them both. What I didn't want to do was give too much information at once. So you can go out, you can watch your 5 to 10 minute lesson, you can go and teach it, and then come back and grab another chunk of that lesson and go and teach that. It breaks it down enough for you. Remember, it's important you understand it properly before you start to teach it to your horse. The other thing you'll find about the training is that the photography is close up. I discuss problems. I show you mistakes. There's no sort of 30 minutes from a great distance with me talking in the wind. I want you to learn this stuff, and I want you to be successful, because if you're successful, you're going to come back for more. Anyway, thank you very much for staying. And you can get subscription from just $32 on the candoclub.com site. And I hope to see you in the members area soon. Bye-bye.